The New Mexico Territory sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Martinez's failing ranch, turning the cracked adobe walls of his modest home into an oven that made even the rattlesnakes seek shade elsewhere. At 40, Jake carried the weathered look of a man who'd spent 2 decades chasing dreams that always seemed to slip through his fingers like desert sand. His ranch, if it could still be called that, consisted of 40 acres of scrub brush, a dozen cattle that were more bone than beef, and buildings that held together through stubbornness and prayer rather than any structural integrity. The barn leaned at an angle that defied physics. The corral fence was held up by twisted wire and hope, and his adobe house leaked when it rained, which, in this drought-stricken summer of 1885, hadn't happened in 3 months. Jake sat on his sagging porch, boots propped on a wooden crate that served as both furniture and storage, staring at the letter that had arrived with yesterday's mail. The bank in Santa Fe was calling in his loan, giving him 30 days to pay the $400 he owed or face foreclosure. $400 might as well have been $4,000 for all the chance he had of raising it. Guess that's that, Jake muttered to his horse Rex, a faithful bay gelding who was probably worth more than everything else Jake owned combined. Looks like we'll be looking for work on someone else's spread come September. It wasn't the life Jake had imagined when he'd bought the ranch 8 years ago with money saved from his days as a cavalry scout. Back then he'd dreamed of building something lasting, a home, maybe a family, certainly a legacy more substantial than the collection of debts and disappointments his life had become. His nearest neighbor, Tom Wilson, lived 15 miles south and owned a successful spread with 300 head of cattle and enough hands to work them properly. Tom had offered Jake work before, but taking a job punching cattle for another man felt like admitting defeat in a way that Jake wasn't quite ready to accept. The morning heat was already brutal at 8 o'clock, promising another day where the temperature would climb well over 100 degrees. Jake decided to ride the fence line on the north pasture, partly because it needed checking, and partly because sitting still in the heat made him feel like he was slowly cooking from the inside out. As he saddled Rex, Jake noticed something unusual in the distance, a figure walking along the old Pueblo road that ran past his property. Walking, not riding, which was strange enough in this heat and terrain. But as the figure drew closer, Jake realized it was a woman, and she was walking with the careful, labored gait of someone very pregnant. Jake shaded his eyes with his hand, squinting against the harsh morning light. The woman appeared to be Apache, based on her clothing and the way she carried herself, but she was alone and on foot in some of the most inhospitable country in New Mexico Territory. No Apache woman would travel alone unless something had gone very wrong. As she reached the edge of his property, the woman stumbled and nearly fell. Jake saw her catch herself against a fence post, her hand pressed to her swollen belly. Her dark head bowed with exhaustion that was visible even from a distance. Jake's mother, God rest her soul, had raised him with firm ideas about helping people in distress, regardless of their race or circumstances. Jacob, she used to say, you judge a man's character by how he treats those who can't do nothing for him in return. Without thinking too hard about the complications he might be inviting into his already difficult life, Jake swung into Rex's saddle and rode toward the exhausted woman by the roadside. "Ma'am," he called out as he approached, keeping his voice gentle and his hands visible. "You look like you could use some help." The woman raised her head, and Jake found himself looking into dark eyes that held a mixture of wariness, exhaustion, and something that might have been hope. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 28, with the kind of natural beauty that showed even through the dust and fatigue that marked her journey. "Water," she said in accented but clear English. "Please, water." Jake dismounted immediately, pulling his canteen from the saddle and offering it to her with both hands. She drank deeply, gratefully, water running down her chin as she tried to satisfy a thirst that had probably been building for hours. "Thank you," she whispered when she'd drunk enough to speak clearly. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be out here alone in your condition. Where are you trying to get to?" The woman's expression grew guarded, and Jake realized he'd touched on whatever crisis had put her on this road alone and pregnant. "Is safe place?" she asked instead of answering his question. Jake looked around at his ramshackle ranch, his failing cattle operation, and his uncertain future. "It ain't much," he said honestly, "but it's peaceful and there's shade and more water. You're welcome to rest here as long as you need." Something in his tone, perhaps the complete absence of judgment or demand for explanation, seemed to decide her. The Apache woman nodded and allowed Jake to help her onto Rex for the short ride to his barn, where she could rest in cool shadows while he figured out what help she might need. What Jake didn't know was that his simple offer of water and shelter had just set in motion events that would transform not only his own life, but the entire relationship between Apache and Mexican communities in the New Mexico territory. Jake helped the pregnant Apache woman down from Rex's saddle with the careful gentleness he'd use handling a wounded bird. She moved slowly, one hand always supporting her swollen belly, the other gripping his arm with surprising strength. Up close, he could see that her traditional Apache dress was torn in several places and stained with dust and sweat from what must have been a long, difficult journey. The barn's cooler than the house, Jake explained as he guided her toward the leaning structure that somehow continued to provide decent shelter despite its questionable architecture. Got fresh hay for bedding and a well just outside. You can rest there as long as you need. The woman nodded gratefully but said nothing. Jake noticed that her silence seemed deliberate rather than unfriendly, as if she were carefully considering each word before speaking, or perhaps protecting information she wasn't ready to share. Inside the barn, Jake quickly arranged a comfortable resting area using clean horse blankets and fresh hay. The thick adobe walls kept the interior significantly cooler than the brutal heat outside, and the familiar smells of hay and leather created a peaceful atmosphere that seemed to help the woman relax slightly. "I'm Jake Martinez," he said, as he settled her in the improvised bed. "Been ranching here about 8 years, though not too successfully," he added with self-deprecating honesty. "I am Maria," the woman replied after a pause that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Thank you for kindness, Jake Martinez." Jake suspected that Maria wasn't her real name, but he respected her need for privacy. Whatever had brought her to his ranch alone and pregnant was clearly complicated, and he wasn't about to make her situation worse by pressing for information she wasn't ready to give. "When's the baby due?" he asked gently. Maria's hand moved protectively over her belly. "Soon, very soon, maybe today or tomorrow." The news hit Jake like a physical blow. He was a confirmed bachelor who'd never been around pregnant women, much less helped with childbirth. His nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the closest doctor was in Santa Fe, over 40 miles of rough road that would take the better part of a day to travel. "Maria, I got to be honest with you. I don't know nothing about delivering babies. If your time's that close, we might need to get you to someone who knows what they're doing." Fear flickered in Maria's dark eyes. "No, cannot go to town. Cannot go to people who—" She stopped, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "Who what?" Jake asked softly. "Who would take baby from Apache mother?" She finished quietly. Jake felt a surge of anger at the implications of her words. He'd heard stories about government agents who removed mixed-race children from their native mothers, claiming it was for the child's good to be raised in white society away from their tribal heritage. "Maria, I give you my word. Nobody's taking your baby from you while you're under my protection. Don't care if it's the territorial governor himself." The fierce conviction in Jake's voice seemed to reach something deep inside the frightened woman. For the first time since he'd found her, Maria smiled, a tentative expression that transformed her face and gave Jake a glimpse of the person she must be when not running from whatever had driven her to his ranch. "You are good man, Jake Martinez. Your mother raised you well." "She tried to," Jake replied with a sad smile. "Both my parents are gone now, but they'd have liked you." As the day wore on, Jake brought Maria fresh water, simple food, and clean cloth for washing. He checked on her regularly but gave her space to rest and process whatever fears were driving her journey. By evening, it was clear that she was in the early stages of labor. Not immediate danger, but definitely approaching the time when her baby would arrive. "Jake," Maria called to him as the sun set and painted the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and crimson. "There is something you should know. Tomorrow my people will come looking for me." "Your people?" "My father is Chief Eagle Feather of the Mescalero Band. When they find me here—" She paused, then met his eyes directly. "They will not understand why Apache woman stays with Mexican rancher. They may think you took me against my will." Jake felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. If Apache warriors found their chief's pregnant daughter in his barn, They might assume the worst and act accordingly. He could be facing a war party by morning. How many warriors? He asked quietly. Many, Maria replied. My father is careful, man. He will bring enough warriors to handle any trouble. Jake nodded, accepting this information with the same calm he'd shown throughout their encounter. Well then, I guess we better hope your baby decides to wait until after we get this misunderstanding cleared up. But as he settled down for what might be his last night on Earth, Jake Martinez realized that he didn't regret his decision to help a pregnant woman in need, regardless of what consequences might arrive with the dawn. As darkness settled over the New Mexico desert, Jake sat outside his barn door with his old Winchester rifle across his knees, not because he planned to fight Apache warriors and that would be suicide, but because the familiar weight of the weapon provided comfort during what might be his final night alive. Inside the barn, Maria rested fitfully, her labor progressing slowly but steadily. Jake had assisted with enough difficult cattle births to recognize the signs, though he fervently hoped the baby would wait until after sunrise and whatever confrontation the new day might bring. Jake, Maria called softly from inside the barn. He entered to find her sitting up in the hay, her face pale with pain but her expression determined. The baby comes tonight, she said with the certainty of a woman who understood her own body's signals. Jake felt panic rising in his chest. He was about to help deliver a baby under the worst possible circumstances, alone with no medical knowledge while expecting a war party to arrive at dawn. What do I need to do? He asked, pushing his fears aside to focus on immediate necessity. Water, clean water, and cloth for wrapping baby, and... Maria paused, then continued with obvious difficulty. You must understand something about my child. What about your child? Maria's eyes filled with tears that she struggled to control. The father was Lieutenant William Thompson from Fort Stanton. He promised to marry me, promised we would make life together. But when his commanding officer learned about the baby, she couldn't finish the sentence. Jake understood. A white army officer having relations with an Apache woman was controversial enough. Having a child with her was career-ending and potentially dangerous for everyone involved. Where is Thompson now? Transferred to California. He left me letters saying he's sorry, but his duty to Army must come first. The bitterness in Maria's voice could have cut glass. Jake began to understand why Maria had been traveling alone, why she feared both white authorities and her own people's reaction to her situation. As the daughter of a chief, her pregnancy by a white soldier would be seen as either betrayal or victimization by her tribe, while white society would view her as a woman who had tempted an honorable officer into disgraceful behavior. Maria, none of that matters now. What matters is getting you and your baby through this safely. Over the next several hours, Jake found himself playing midwife to a process that was simultaneously terrifying and miraculous. Maria bore her labor with stoic courage that amazed him, rarely crying out even during the strongest contractions, trusting him to help her through an ordeal that left him sweating with anxiety, despite his determination to remain calm. At 3 a.m, as coyotes called to each other across the desert and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Maria's son entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the barn and announced his arrival to the sleeping ranch. He's perfect, Jake whispered as he carefully wrapped the infant in clean cloth and placed him in his mother's arms. Perfect and healthy and loud enough to wake the dead. Maria gazed down at her son with an expression of pure love that made Jake's throat tighten with emotion. Despite everything she'd endured, abandonment, exile, the uncertainty of her future, in this moment she was simply a mother holding her newborn child. What will you name him? Jake asked. Joseph, Maria replied. Joseph Eagle Thompson. He will carry names from both his peoples and maybe someday that will be blessing instead of burden. As dawn approached, Jake heard what he'd been dreading. The distant sound of many horses approaching from the north. The sound grew steadily louder, accompanied by the rhythmic beating of war drums that sent chills down his spine. They come, Maria said quietly, clutching her baby closer. Jake looked out through a gap in the barn wall and felt his mouth go dry. The horizon was dark with riders, not just a few warriors, but what looked like an entire war party spreading across the valley floor like an approaching storm. Maria, you stay here with the baby. No matter what happens outside, you keep that child safe. Jake, you must understand, my father will be angry. Chief Eaglefeather does not forgive easily, and he will think you have dishonored his daughter. Maybe I can make him understand that it wasn't like that. Maybe, Maria said doubtfully. But if you cannot, if things go badly, promise me you will tell my son that his mother loved him. Jake looked down at the newborn infant sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, innocent of the cultural forces that had already made his young life so complicated. You'll tell him yourself, Jake said firmly. We're going to get through this. But as the war drums grew louder and the mass of Apache warriors drew closer to his ranch, Jake Martinez wondered if his last act in this life would be trying to explain to an angry chief why his daughter had given birth in a Mexican cowboy's barn. The sight that greeted Jake as he stepped from his barn at sunrise would remain burned into his memory for the rest of his life. 300 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses in perfect formation across his valley, their war paint and weapons creating a display of military power that dwarfed anything he'd seen during his cavalry days. At the formation center rode a man Jake immediately recognized as Chief Eaglefeather, even though he'd never met him personally. The chief's bearing, the deference shown him by the other warriors, and the elaborate silver ornaments decorating his horse all proclaimed his status as one of the most powerful Apache leaders in New Mexico territory. Chief Eaglefeather rode forward alone, stopping 50 yards from Jake's barn. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the desert air, pitched to be heard by everyone present. Mexican, the chief called in accented but clear English, you will return my daughter to me now, or you will die where you stand. Jake walked forward slowly, his hands visible and empty, trying to project calm he didn't feel. Chief Eaglefeather, your daughter is safe. She came to my ranch needing help and I gave it freely with respect and honor. My daughter would not come to Mexican ranch willingly. You took her, and now you will pay Apache price for stealing Chief's daughter. I didn't steal anybody, Jake replied firmly. Your daughter was walking alone on the road, pregnant and exhausted. I offered her shelter because it was the right thing to do. Chief Eaglefeather's expression grew darker. Pregnant? My daughter left our village to visit her cousin 2 weeks ago. She was not pregnant then. Jake realized that Maria hadn't told her father about the baby, which explained the chief's confusion and anger. The situation was even more complex than he'd understood. Chief Eaglefeather, your daughter can speak for herself about what happened. She's inside the barn with her newborn son, both of them safe and healthy. The word newborn hit the Apache formation like a thunderbolt. Warriors exchanged rapid conversations in their native language, and Jake could see the news spreading through the ranks like wildfire. Chief Eaglefeather dismounted and approached the barn with swift, purposeful strides. Jake had no choice but to follow, though he wondered if he was walking toward his own execution. Inside the barn, Maria looked up from nursing her baby, her face a mixture of relief at seeing her father and fear of his reaction to her situation. Father, she said quietly in Apache, then switched to English. This is Jake Martinez. He saved my life and helped bring your grandson into the world. Chief Eaglefeather stared at his daughter, then at the infant in her arms, then at Jake. The chief's weathered face worked through a series of emotions, confusion, anger, disappointment, and finally something that might have been understanding. Explain, he said simply. What followed was Maria's full story, told in a mixture of Apache and English that Jake could only partially follow. But he understood enough to see Chief Eaglefeather's expression shift from anger at Jake to rage at Lieutenant Thompson, who had abandoned the chief's daughter after making her pregnant. When Maria finished her account, the barn was silent except for the baby's soft breathing. Finally, Chief Eaglefeather turned to Jake with an expression that was impossible to read. You knew my daughter carried white man's child? I knew she was pregnant and scared and needed help, Jake replied. That's all that mattered to me. You knew Apache warriors might come looking for her? She warned me you'd probably come. I figured you might not understand the situation at first. Yet you helped her anyway, knowing it might cost your life. Jake looked at Maria holding her newborn son, then back at the Apache chief. Chief Eaglefeather, your daughter needed help bringing new life into this world. Seems to me that's worth any risk. The chief studied Jake's face for a long moment, then did something that stunned everyone present. He smiled. Martinez, Chief Eaglefeather said. You have honor that many men lack, regardless of their race. My daughter and grandson live because of your courage and kindness." The chief turned to address his warriors in Apache, speaking at length with obvious authority. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could read the body language as 300 warriors gradually relaxed their aggressive postures. "I have told my people that you are friend to Apache," Chief Eaglefeather explained to Jake. "We do not forget kindness shown to our family." As the immediate threat of violence passed, Jake felt weak with relief. But he also realized that his simple act of helping a pregnant woman had created connections and obligations that would influence the rest of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. What happened over the following hours transformed Jake's understanding of Apache culture and his own place in the complex social fabric of New Mexico territory. Chief Eaglefeather had not simply brought a war party, he had brought an entire community prepared for whatever circumstances they might encounter. Apache women emerged from positions behind the warriors, carrying supplies for caring for a new mother and infant. Elderly men approached with bundles of herbs and medicines traditional to Apache childbirth customs. Children ran between the adults with the excited energy of people celebrating the arrival of new family member. In Apache tradition, Chief Eaglefeather explained to Jake as the community organized itself around Maria and baby Joseph. The birth of a child is cause for great celebration, but the birth of a child protected by the kindness of strangers requires special recognition. Jake watched in amazement as Apache families set up a temporary village in his valley. Within hours, his failing ranch had been transformed into the site of one of the largest intertribal gatherings in recent territorial history. "Chief Eaglefeather," Jake said, "I appreciate the honor you're showing me, but I don't have food or supplies for this many people. My ranch isn't exactly prosperous right now." The chief smiled. "Martinez, we did not come to take from you. We came to give." What followed was a demonstration of Apache generosity that left Jake speechless. Families presented him with beautifully crafted items that represented months of skilled work. Beaded clothing, silver jewelry, painted pottery, and carved wooden items of obvious artistic and monetary value. But the gifts went beyond material items. Apache men examined his failing cattle operation with expert eyes and quickly identified problems that Jake's limited experience had missed. Within hours, they were implementing solutions that drew on generations of animal husbandry knowledge adapted to desert conditions. "Your cattle are not getting right minerals from grass," explained Running Bear, Chief Eaglefeather's brother, and the tribe's expert on livestock management. "We know places where good salt and minerals can be found. Also, you need different grazing pattern to keep grass healthy." Apache women worked with quiet efficiency to improve Jake's living conditions. They repaired his leaking roof using traditional techniques that would withstand desert weather better than his original construction. They organized his meager supplies with an efficiency that made everything seem more abundant. "They're taking better care of me than I've taken care of myself in years," Jake admitted to Maria as she rested in the barn with baby Joseph. "My people believe that kindness creates debts that must be repaid," Maria explained. "But more than that, they see you as family now. You helped bring Apache child into world safely. That makes you grandfather to Joseph, which makes you family to all of us." The concept of being adopted into Apache family structure was foreign to Jake, but he could see the practical benefits. His failing ranch was being transformed by the application of traditional knowledge that white settlers had never bothered to learn from the native peoples who had successfully managed this landscape for centuries. But the most significant moment came when Chief Eaglefeather called Jake aside for a private conversation that would determine his future in ways he couldn't yet. "Understand, Martinez," the chief said seriously. "I want to make formal offer. My daughter needs husband who will accept her child and treat them both with honor. You have proven yourself worthy of trust. Would you consider marriage to Maria?" The proposal hit Jake like a physical blow. He looked toward the barn where Maria was nursing baby Joseph, this beautiful woman who had stumbled into his life just 2 days earlier and already changed everything about his understanding of family, honor, and responsibility. "Chief Eaglefeather, I'm honored by your offer, but Maria should have a say in who she marries. She's been through enough without having her future decided by men, even men who care about her." The chief's expression showed approval rather than offense at Jake's response. "You speak wisely. A woman should choose her own path when possible. But I will tell you this. Maria has already spoken favorably about your character. The choice may be easier than you think. That evening, as the Apache camp settled into the rhythms of community life, Jake found himself sitting beside Maria as she rocked baby Joseph to sleep. The normal sounds of family life, children playing, adults talking quietly, cooking fires crackling, created an atmosphere of peace that Jake had never experienced in his years of solitary ranching. "Maria," he said quietly, "your father suggested that you and I might consider making this arrangement more permanent." Maria looked up at him with dark eyes that held warmth, gratitude, and something that might have been deeper affection. "Jake Martinez," she said softly, "would you truly want Apache wife and mixed-blood stepson? It would not be easy life in territorial society." "Seems to me," Jake replied, "that easy lives are overrated. I'd rather have a difficult life with people I care about than an easy life all alone." As the New Mexico stars wheeled overhead and baby Joseph slept peacefully between them, Jake and Maria began planning a future that neither could have imagined just 3 days earlier, a future built on the foundation of one man's simple decision to offer shelter to a pregnant woman in need. 3 months after the night Jake Martinez helped deliver Chief Eaglefeather's grandson in his barn, the struggling ranch in the New Mexico desert had become the most prosperous agricultural operation in the territory. The transformation was so dramatic that territorial officials and neighboring ranchers made regular visits to see for themselves how a failing Mexican cowboy and his Apache wife had revolutionized desert farming. Jake and Maria's wedding had been a landmark event, conducted according to both Catholic and Apache traditions in a ceremony that drew over 500 guests from across New Mexico territory. The marriage was more than a union between two individuals. It represented the first formal alliance between Mexican and Apache communities in the region's recorded history. "The secret," Jake explained to a group of visiting ranchers from Santa Fe, "is listening to people who've been successfully living on this land for centuries, instead of assuming that European farming methods are automatically better. The Apache techniques, that Running Bear and other tribal experts had taught Jake, were producing results that seemed almost miraculous to men accustomed to the boom and bust cycles of traditional territorial ranching. By understanding seasonal water patterns, mineral deposits, and native plant relationships, Jake's operation was thriving even during the continuing drought that had devastated neighboring spreads. "Your cattle look healthier than any I've seen in the territory," observed Colonel Harrison Webb, the territorial livestock inspector. "What are you feeding them?" "Same grass as everyone else," Jake replied, "but we're rotating grazing areas according to Apache traditional knowledge about when different areas provide the best nutrition. Turns out the native peoples figured out sustainable land management long before any of us got here." Maria emerged from their rebuilt adobe house carrying baby Joseph, now a chubby, healthy 3-month-old who had become the unofficial mascot of the ranch. The house itself was testament to the success of their intercultural cooperation. Traditional Apache building techniques had been combined with Mexican architectural elements to create a structure that was both beautiful and perfectly adapted to desert conditions. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you next week," Maria told Jake as she settled beside him on the porch that now provided comfortable seating for the steady stream of visitors their success attracted. "What does he want?" "Father says Governor Ross is interested in our agricultural methods for the territory's development program. If Apache techniques can make this desert productive, they could transform the entire regional economy." Jake felt mixed emotions about the political attention their success was attracting. On one hand, recognition might lead to greater acceptance for intercultural cooperation and better treatment for Apache communities throughout the territory. On the other hand, government involvement had a way of complicating everything it touched. "What does Chief Eaglefeather think about dealing with territorial officials?" "He says that prosperity brings opportunity but also danger. If our methods become too valuable to white settlers, they might try to take credit for traditional knowledge that belongs to Apache people." The concern was well-founded. Jake had already heard ranchers discussing ways to implement Martinez methods without acknowledging their Apache origins. The racism that made such attitudes possible also threatened the delicate balance of cooperation that had made their success possible. That afternoon brought a visitor who would test everything Jake and Maria had built together. Lieutenant William Thompson, Joseph's biological father, arrived at the ranch in full military dress, accompanied by 2 junior officers and an obvious determination to assert some kind of claim to the child he had abandoned. "Mrs. Martinez," Thompson said formally as he dismounted before the house, "I've come to discuss arrangements for my son's future." Jake stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Thompson and his family. "Lieutenant, far as I know, you gave up any rights to discuss that child's future when you transferred to California and left his mother to face the consequences alone." "I was following orders," Thompson replied stiffly, "but circumstances have changed. I'm being reassigned to Fort Stanton, and I'm prepared to provide financial support for the boy's upbringing." "What kind of arrangements did you have in mind?" Maria asked, her voice carefully controlled. "The child should receive a proper American education. There are excellent boarding schools in the East that specialize in mixed-race children. I'm prepared to pay for his enrollment and ensure he receives every advantage available to young men of his background." The offer was presented as generous, but Jake and Maria both understood its implications. Taking Joseph away from his Apache heritage, from his adoptive father, and from the intercultural community where he was loved and wanted. "Lieutenant Thompson," Jake said quietly, "Joseph already has a father who's prepared to give him everything he needs: love, family, education, and knowledge of both his Apache and Mexican heritage. What he doesn't need is to be torn away from people who want him in order to satisfy the conscience of someone who abandoned him." The confrontation that followed would determine not only Joseph's future, but the survival of the remarkable community that had grown around Jake and Maria's unlikely partnership. Lieutenant William, Thompson's attempt to claim Joseph created a crisis that forced the entire territorial community to confront its assumptions about family, race, and the rights of parents versus the welfare of children. Within hours of Thompson's arrival, word had spread throughout the region that the biological father of the famous Martinez baby was asserting legal claims that could tear apart the most successful intercultural family in New Mexico territory. "I have legal standing as the child's father," Thompson argued during a tense meeting in Jake's parlor. "Whatever informal arrangements you've made with the mother, they don't supersede my parental rights under territorial law." "And what about the mother's rights?" Maria asked, her voice carrying the controlled anger of a woman protecting her child. "What about the rights of the man who helped bring Joseph into the world and has been his father every day since?" Thompson's discomfort was obvious, but he pressed his case with military determination. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm not trying to be cruel, but this child deserves opportunities that can only be provided through proper legal recognition and appropriate education. The boarding schools I mentioned would prepare him for a successful life in American society." "You mean they would teach him to be ashamed of his Apache heritage?" Chief Eaglefeather said quietly from the doorway, where he'd been listening to the conversation. The chief's presence transformed the dynamic immediately, reminding everyone that this wasn't just a dispute between individuals, but a conflict that involved the honor and interests of an entire Apache band. "Chief Eaglefeather," Thompson said, clearly uncomfortable with the chief's presence, "I respect your position as the child's grandfather, but we need to think about what's best for his future in a changing world." "What is best for child," the chief replied, "is to grow up knowing he is loved and wanted, not separated from family because white man feels guilty about abandoning his responsibilities." Jake watched the confrontation with growing concern. Thompson clearly had legal advantages. Territorial courts generally favored white fathers over native mothers in custody disputes, regardless of the circumstances. But Jake also understood that taking Joseph from Maria and the Apache community would destroy the trust that had made their intercultural cooperation possible. "Lieutenant," Jake said carefully, "what if we could work out an arrangement that gives Joseph the best of both worlds? He stays here with his mother and me, learns Apache and Mexican traditions from his family, but also receives the formal education you think is important? How would that work?" Maria stepped forward with a proposal that demonstrated the diplomatic skills she'd inherited from her father. "Joseph spends most of his time here, learning from both Apache and Mexican family members. But during winter months, he attends school in Santa Fe, where he can receive formal American education while still returning home to his family." It was a reasonable compromise that addressed Thompson's stated concerns while preserving the family bonds that were essential to Joseph's emotional well-being. But Thompson's response revealed that his real concerns weren't about education. "The boy needs to understand his place in American society," Thompson said bluntly. "Growing up on an Apache ranch with a Mexican stepfather won't prepare him for the challenges he'll face as a mixed-race individual in the territories." "What challenges?" Jake asked pointedly. "The challenges of being accepted in white society while carrying Indian blood," Thompson replied. "The sooner he learns to navigate those realities, the better his chances of success." Chief Eagle Feather stepped forward, his dignity intact, despite the insult implicit in Thompson's words. "Lieutenant, you speak of preparing boy for white society that may never accept him regardless of his education. We speak of raising him in community that loves him exactly as he is." The debate continued for hours, with Thompson growing increasingly frustrated as his legal arguments met practical and emotional objections from people who had already proven their commitment to Joseph's welfare. Finally, Maria ended the discussion with a declaration that surprised everyone. "Lieutenant Thompson, you want to do what is best for our son. Very well. We will let Joseph decide." "The child is 3 months old," Thompson protested. "He can't make such a decision." "Not now," Maria agreed. "But when he is old enough to understand the choice, perhaps when he turns 16, we will present him with both options. He can choose life in white society with the education and opportunities you offer. Or he can choose to remain with the family that raised him with love and respect for all his heritage." The proposal was bold and unprecedented, but it satisfied the territorial magistrate who had been called in to mediate the dispute. Joseph would remain with Jake and Maria until he came of age, at which point he could choose his own future with full knowledge of all his options. As Lieutenant Thompson rode away from the ranch, clearly unsatisfied with the compromise but legally bound by the magistrate's ruling, Jake realized that the confrontation had actually strengthened, rather than threatened, their family. The community's support for Maria and Joseph had been overwhelming, demonstrating that their intercultural experiment had created bonds stronger than legal documents or social prejudice. "You took a big risk," Jake told Maria as they watched Thompson's dust cloud disappear toward Fort Stanton. "What if Joseph chooses to leave when he's 16? Maria smiled, bouncing baby Joseph gently in her arms. "Then we will have raised him well enough to make his own wise choices." "But Jake, a child who grows up knowing he is completely loved and accepted, will not easily choose to leave that love for the uncertain welcome of a society that judges him by his blood rather than his character." Chief Eagle Feather nodded approvingly at his daughter's wisdom. "Thompson offers Joseph opportunity to be accepted by some white people if he rejects half his heritage. We offer him opportunity to be whole person accepted by family who loves all of who he is." The chief's words proved prophetic. As months passed and Joseph grew from infant to toddler, he became the living symbol of successful intercultural cooperation throughout New Mexico territory. Visitors came from across the Southwest to see the ranch where Apache, Mexican, and Anglo communities had learned to work together for mutual benefit. "Governor Ross wants to use our ranch as a model for territorial development policy," Jake told Maria one evening as they watched 2-year-old Joseph playing with Apache and Mexican children whose families had joined their growing community. "What does that mean?" "It means the territorial government wants to encourage other intercultural partnerships like ours. They're offering land grants to families willing to implement Apache agricultural techniques and establish similar cooperative communities." Maria looked thoughtful. "That could be good for our people if it brings respect for Apache knowledge, but it could also bring problems if it attracts people who want to profit from our traditions without understanding their sacred significance." The concern was well-founded, but Jake was optimistic about the precedent their success had established. "Maybe the most important thing we've proven is that cooperation works better than conflict. Maybe other folks will figure out the respect part once they see the practical benefits." As the sun set over their thriving ranch, Jake Martinez reflected on how completely his life had changed since that morning, 2 years ago when he'd found a pregnant Apache woman walking alone on the desert road. His failing ranch had become a prosperous agricultural operation. His loneliness had been replaced by a loving wife and growing family. His debts had been paid off with profits from innovative farming methods that drew on centuries of Apache wisdom. But most importantly, he had become part of something larger than himself. a living demonstration that the American West's future lay not in the conquest of one people by another, but in the cooperation of all peoples who chose to make this difficult, beautiful land their home. Baby Joseph, now walking steadily and babbling in a mixture of Apache, Spanish, and English, represented the hope that future generations might grow up in a world where heritage was celebrated rather than hidden, where differences were seen as strengths rather than barriers, and where the simple act of offering shelter to a stranger in need could still change the course of history.